Barbara, I know your two separate organizations came to one, and and also how you think things went on June 18th, and where we go from here, and what the next steps are. So, Bob, do you want to add anything before we turn the platform over to our esteemed guest, Dr. Liz?
Absolutely. I just see the connection of the theme of this year's World Unity Week, coming home together, as so significant and so bound up and aligned with that of the Poor People's Campaign, because together, coming home together, and that which the Poor People's Campaign has been actively doing for a number of years and which stepped up the game even more, is about that together part, because it's a recognition that every human is our brother and sister, and it's a recognition that every child is our child. And while there's many elements of these discussions that sound like they're in a political context where we've been programmed to say the other group or this group, this is a moral discussion. It is a moral crisis and a humanity crisis. And we're just really delighted to have you here, Liz, and have the opportunity for others to learn more about the campaign. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Ben, for the opportunity.
And I think we're going to turn it over to you, Dr. Liz.
Well, awesome. It's great to be with everybody, and thanks so much for this invitation. As folks said, my name is Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. I'm the co-chair proudly of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And that campaign is organized in more than 40 states across the United States, and made up and led by those that are most impacted by poverty and low wealth, by moral leaders and clergy, by activists, by advocates. And we come together to address these interlocking injustices, and we see particularly 5. We start with the problem of systemic racism, and look at systemic racism through the structural ways, the policy ways that racism is so alive and so well in this society. Whether it's the attack on voting rights, the fact that we have fewer voting rights today than we did 50, 60 years ago, the fact that we're actually witnessing the greatest attack on our democracy since right after the Civil War and Reconstruction. But we also look at the mass incarceration crisis, the crisis of police brutality, the crisis of the mistreatment of Indigenous and Native peoples, and unjust immigration policies. And we look at all of this, and then we connect it to the problem of poverty. I mean, we live in the richest country in the world. And yet, in these yet to be United States, there are 140 million people who are poor and low income. Just a couple $100 emergency away from absolute economic ruin. That is more than 40% of the US population. So nearly half of the United States is experiencing some form of poverty. And whether that's the 87 million people who before the pandemic had no healthcare insurance or were underinsured, whether that's the tens of millions of people who are unhoused in a nation that has basically 5 abandoned houses for every homeless person, and yet we have tens of millions of people living in a housing crisis. That's the 52 million workers in this country who are working for less than a living wage. And we could keep on going. It's the 14 million families who can't afford water in a country and in a world that's made up of 2/3 water. And then from the crisis of poverty, we see the connection to the ecological crisis and to the crisis that our earth is experiencing. And especially how poor and low income people are hurt first and worst by climate change, by extreme weather events, by the poisoning of our air and our water and land. And then from there, we also see the denial of healthcare as an injustice, in and of itself. How is it that we have been living for years now in the worst public health crisis in generations, and yet we have not seen any expansion of healthcare? And in fact, we've seen people lose their health care in this public health crisis. And what we said at this powerful assembly of thousands upon thousands upon thousands in Washington, D.C. this past week, Bishop Barber, who is the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign alongside of myself, he talked about how, healthcare and the right to health should be linked to our bodies, not to our jobs or our money, but that everybody, should indeed, have this right to live and to thrive in society. And then if we're looking at systemic racism, if we're looking at systemic poverty, if we're looking at the kind of destruction of our earth, we also have to connect it to the militarization of our world and our communities and the kind of war economy that we're living in. I mean, again, the United States spends 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on the military and less than 15 cents on healthcare, on living wage jobs, on programs of social uplift for the poor combined. And so, you can, from the Bible, we have these passages that say, where your treasure is, that's where your heart must be. Well, it's very clear that the United States treasures the military, treasures violence and war, and does not hold close to its heart the 140 million poor people, the 52% of our kids who are living in some form of poverty. And all of this kind of comes together as connected through this false narrative of religious, especially Christian nationalism and white supremacy. And I think, it's so important for the Poor People's Campaign to be calling out this religious nationalism and this narrative that blames poor people, blames queer people, immigrants, people of color, women, for all of society's problems. This narrative that pits us against each other, has us kind of fighting each other instead of kind of coming together. And then also a narrative that feeds us this lie of scarcity, says that this is as good as it gets, that we can't afford to really fully address these problems, when in fact the opposite is the case. As Joseph Stiglitz points out, what we can't afford is the cost of inequality and poverty. The United States spends $1 trillion every year on the fact that we have child poverty and child poverty rates that are just abhorrent. It would be less money, and it would spiritually, be so beneficial to lift those kids out of poverty. But instead, year after year, we allow for poverty and homelessness and hunger, to plague our society. And so the Poor People's Campaign is organizing and mobilizing to do a couple of things. I mean, one is to shift the narrative, get our world, get our nation talking about who is poor, why people are poor, what can be done, what the solutions are at hand. Again, there's no scarcity of resources. There's no scarcity of knowing what it's going to take to actually lift the load of poverty. But right now, there is a scarcity of political will and moral consciousness. And so that's connected then to the work that we're trying to do of shifting that narrative, but then also building power amongst the 140 million people who are poor and low income, into a compelling force that could do what Dr. King said in the last year of his life when he was announcing and calling for and preparing for a Poor People's Campaign, where he said, power for poor people will really mean having the ability, the togetherness, the assertiveness, and the aggressiveness to make the power structures of this nation say yes when they may be desirous of saying no. Now, we, over the past couple of years, after the past decades, have gotten used to no. No to expanding healthcare, no to raising wages, no to protecting our democracy, no to treating immigrants the way that this country should be treating immigrants, in terms of welcoming, in terms of providing for, to turn that no into a yes. It means coming together, mobilizing together, organizing together, registering people for a movement, and engaging folks in organizing and in movement building. And so that's what the Poor People's Campaign is about. This past Saturday on June 18th, we held a mighty mobilization, a mass poor people and low-wage workers assembly, a moral march on Washington and to the polls. I stood on the stage on Pennsylvania Avenue and looked out at the crowd, this diverse crowd of people of all ages and races and ethnicities, of all sexualities and sexual orientations, from all parts of across this country and even from other nations. And I couldn't see the end of the march. I couldn't see, where there weren't people and signs and placards gathered. And who was up on that stage, with myself and with Bishop Barber, were poor and low income people, speaking about the crises that people are going through, but also the solutions, the stories that we have to tell, but also the solutions and programs that exist to actually address these issues. And to me, it was a powerful and mighty mobilization, because for too long we have not heard, we have not seen, we have not listened to those who are experiencing injustice, experiencing low wages, are out there, not being able to provide adequate health care or child care or housing to their families, but who are in no way being silent, but in fact are coming together and organizing together. And so, we in the Poor People's Campaign indeed are calling out to the nation that somebody's been hurting our people. It's gone on for too long, and we won't be silent or unseen or unheard anymore. And I think that's what's happening in this time. In this moment, we see people coming together and organizing together and holding forth the possibility that it does not have to be this way. That indeed, it's always when movements are led by those that are most impacted by injustice, when they come together and band together across all the lines that divide us, that then we're able to build a powerful, mighty, bold, visionary kind of ground up movement that, as we say in this Poor People's Campaign, can lift from the bottom so that everybody can rise, because that is what we're trying to do, and that's what our sacred texts and traditions teach us. I mean, the title of this session is about living the Sermon on the Mount. Now here you have living thousands of years later, people that are whose lives are being cut short because of poverty and low wealth, just like they were thousands of years ago. But there was a message from Jesus, and I come from a Christian tradition. We have folks of many different faiths and people not of faith that are in our work. But that tradition of that Sermon on the Mount, it's blessed are you who are poor in breath, who are crying out, we can't breathe, because yours is to be the reign, the kind of world of God. And we have, this message of blessed are you who mourn, because you, as a collective body of people, when you cry out and saying, we must wail for our kids who are no more. We must wail for our communities that are under assault, because you will be comforted, and you'll be comforted by the fact that we're coming together and organizing together. Blessed are you who cry peace in a world of violence, because you are indeed blessed, because any society that puts more value on guns than it does on our kids is a society that, as Dr. King says, is approaching spiritual death. And we cannot just stand for that. We cannot live for that. And in fact, people are not, and are organizing and mobilizing in bold and beautiful ways, to say that it's unjust and immoral and wrong and does not have to be, that our society has gotten used to the death of poor people. Before pandemic hit, there were 250,000 people that were dying every year, 700 people a day in the richest country in the world, from poverty and inequality. And what we saw in the course of the last couple of years of the pandemic with COVID is that 2 to 5 times as many poor people have been dying as richer people. When we see the kind of violence and shootings and that are taking place across our society, we can see who's being hurt worst and first by that are poor communities. And we have to affirm that everybody's got a right to live, and that the lives of poor and low income people matter greatly, and that we're going to keep on organizing and making it so that it's possible for people to thrive in this society and not just barely survive. And so, everyone here, if you're not already, and it's amazing to be with folks that are already involved in the Poor People's Campaign, but this is an all call moment. To live in a moment when people have raw sewage in their yards, and mold in their homes, to live in a place, where, more resources are spent separating families than actually addressing poverty, to live at a time when we now call frontline workers and low-wage workers essential, but we do not pay them enough for the essentials of life. To live in this moment, it requires that we come together and organize together and build the kind of moral fusion movement across all the lines that divide us, that has the power and capability of actually changing things for the better for people. And so we all are needed. We all are welcome. And what we see happening is a powerful movement for change growing. And it's great to be in the mix and in the numbers with you all as we make that change.
In here, we do have questions, and I invite people to put questions and comments in the chat, and we'll bring them to Dr. Liz. I want you to explain a term that you use, Christian nationalism, that is recently surfaced in my, that's why you're here, to expand my world, expand everyone's world who is hearing this, because, quite frankly, this is a fabulous thing, this World Unity Week. This is the 3rd year we're doing this, reaching out to, I think we eventually reach out to 50 million people. But I will say that probably we're not speaking to the poor here. And so that's why I think it's so important that you are here to represent the Poor People's Campaign, because we need education. We need to know what's going on with our brothers and sisters. And but this movement that you talked about, this Christian nationalism, is that Jesus's movement, or is that something else that we're up against? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think what we saw, what we're seeing in a lot of the kind of injustices in our society today have a direct connection to really a political movement of white Christian nationalists. And I think folks saw that on January 6th. And now that the commission is kind of meeting and people are hearing more about what really went on and what was really behind it, we saw some real forces that are not new to this society, but who have been emboldened and have reached positions of power and influence in ways that I think is more new. So this kind of Christian nationalism, is a kind of ideology that talks about the kind of supremacy of the United States, the supremacy of white people, that talks about, kind of covers that supremacy with a religiosity, a theology that again, blames and divides, many different kinds of people, and then this kind of, and organizes people into a political movement that really is very counter to what our kind of sacred texts and teachings are. And I think that this is when we look at U.S. history, there's always been kind of a battle for the Bible, a battle of theology that takes place, especially in moments of great crisis. So if we go back to enslavement and abolition, you had slave masters have a slave Bible that took out the Exodus, that took out Jesus' inaugural sermon, that removed all the prophets, and put forward instead a theology and a biblical interpretation that said that slavery is ordained by God, and that and had just like a deeply racist core to it all. But at the same time as slave holders had that theology and produced their own Bible, this heretical anathema Bible, you had abolitionists and leaders like Harriet Moses Tubman, and that wasn't like a cute little nickname. And that was how she was viewed. It was the role she was playing. You had Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe and many different folks actually battling out in sermons, in our kind of religious views, what our texts and traditions say about oppression and enslavement and liberation. And so, and if we look through other moments of U.S. history, whether it's the social gospel movement and the industrial union movement, whether it's the Black freedom struggles, or the movement for women's suffrage, you have kind of a battle take place, but always, there's another side to the story, and that side is going back into these texts and traditions and seeing what do they really say, and really teach about issues of justice and truth and love and liberation. And there are many folks who have kind of gone through and studied our texts and found that in fact, if you take out liberation, if you take out freedom, if you take out justice, if you take out poverty, the Bible falls apart. There's an arc starting in Genesis and going all the way through Revelation of justice for the poor, justice for the marginalized, and in fact the kind of core story over and over and over again in our religious texts is about God being on the side, hearing the cries of the people, being on the side of the people, and then intervening through people to bring about movements for change and justice. And I think it's very clear in our texts that the way that you honor and worship God is by welcoming the immigrant neighbor and organizing society around the needs of everybody, including and starting with the poor. And so to have such a powerful kind of white Christian nationalist movement is completely anathema to actually our texts and traditions. And again, I want to quote Reverend Dr. Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, where he talks about how often these days we have these Christian nationalists praying, like PRAYing over politicians and faith leaders that are praying PREYing on the poor, on the marginalized, on the sick, and that this is exactly opposite of what our texts and traditions actually teach.
Thank you so much for that. Again, I'm learning things I've never known before. I did not know about the slave Bible, and your point about taking out, how the Bible just falls apart if you don't talk about the poor and poverty. And I'm also a treasurer of our local League of Women Voters. And that was one thing that we did on the bus on the way back, was try to get people registered to vote, to take some action right away, So we had an 8-hour bus ride up there. It was a 24-hour trip. We were there for 8 hours. We came back for 8 hours. But the thing is that one of my great concerns is that democracy is under attack. And in our state, I'm just going to speak from our state. My experience here is that now they have passed a law that if you fall asleep in on state property, it is a felony. What happens when there's a felony? You don't get voting. Your voting rights are taken away. Our state is number 47th in how difficult it is to get your voting rights restored. Now, if that person had fallen asleep on private property, it would have been a misdemeanor. So there are so many things that are happening on the local level. So I don't even want to talk about, the parties. I want to talk about, we need to keep our eye on what's happening on the local level, that is disenfranchising the poor. And, so we want to have a movement based on the power of the poor. And then you have this other force that's coming in going like, well, let's see what we can do about that. I don't think it's an innocent sort of thing that's happening here. It's been a plan, and they've been working the plan for quite some time. As you said, going back to, I don't know, almost to our origins were based on enslavement of not just African Americans, but anyone non-Europeans, basically. So I just want you to comment on action steps that the Poor People's Campaign is putting forward, if you would.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I do think we have to pay attention to the attack on our democracy that is happening right now, from the most local level to the national level. I mean, we really are seeing and witnessing and living through the greatest attack on our democracy and voting rights. You have 55, with the kind of 19 states that have passed 34 voter suppression laws just in 2021, and that disenfranchises 55 million voters who participated in the 2020 election, right? 55 million voters. And the 2020 election and the 2016 election were without the full protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, right? So we already had seen 26 states oversee, the biggest attack on voting rights in 50 years. And then we added, all of these other voter suppression laws. And this is happening. And I think it's really important for us to recognize this. This is happening not because poor and low income people are weak, but it's because people are strong and starting to flex their power and kind of political muscle. Right now, in 2022, 1/3 of the US electorate is poor and low income people. 1/3, right? And yet we go through election cycle after election cycle where we really do not hear the needs and demands and priorities of poor and low income people. And we go through election cycle after election cycle where we have these attacks on our voting rights, right? We go through these elections and because of the lack of transportation, because election day is not a federal holiday, and so people have to work all kinds of jobs. There's even other forms of kind of what ends up being kind of voter suppression, especially for poor and low income people. On top of the voter suppression laws, on top of an electoral system and candidates that are not really talking about low wages or healthcare or many of the issues that are most important. But what we have in that 1/3 of the electorate being poor and low income people is, as we in the Poor People's Campaign are talking about, a kind of sleeping giant that has the ability, the power to shift and redo the entire political landscape. Now, before the 2020 election, we came out with a study. That study showed that in 19 states, that as little as 1% and as much as 19% of poor and low income voters voting together could change, could beat the margin of error for every election. In some places it was like 1, 2, 3, 4% more poor and low income voters turning out and voting for change, voting for healthcare, voting for, we never will endorse any candidates. We will never, side with any particular party. But we are seeing the power and potential of what it looks like to enlarge and enliven this electorate of poor and low income people. And so, this is a fight for our lives right now, a fight for the life of our democracy right now. But what we see is that poor and low income people, especially organizing and voting around an agenda across these lines that divide us, across issue, across race, across geography. And in 2020, the Poor People's Campaign reached out to millions of poor and low income, what they call low propensity voters, and had a tremendous impact. It was poor and low income people who made up the difference in all of the battleground areas and races and states in the 2020 election. And what we know is that's connected to this pushback on voting rights, but it's also connected to the power and potential that we have. And so please, I hope that folks will get involved in the work that we're doing. We put out on June 18th at our Mass Poor People's Assembly 7 steps that we're doing kind of leading up to the midterms. We're calling on all of our congressional representatives to actually lift up and prioritize the needs and demands of poor and low income people. We're calling out our congressional representatives to actually vote for, if they haven't already, a third Reconstruction, fully addressing poverty and low wages from the bottom up resolution that was introduced by some folks inspired by the agenda of the Poor People's Campaign. We're calling on the White House to have a summit with poor and low income leaders, economists and religious folk, to actually hear the stories and the solutions coming out of poor and low income communities. And we are going to spend the 150 days mobilizing and registering and reaching out, in text banking and phone banking and door-to-door organizing, poor and low income voters. And we want folk to join us in doing that work, because again, we know that there is a power there. It's not because people's votes don't matter. They wouldn't be trying to steal them so much if it didn't matter. And that's why we're calling on people, and we're going to engage in what we call mobilizing, organizing, registering, and engaging people for a movement that votes. And so I hope that folk will join the Poor People's Campaign, be a part of some of our text banks and other kind of activities, join some of our state campaigns and get involved, in the midterms and beyond, as we kind of organize to realize this multiracial democracy from the bottom up.
Thank you, Liz. That this building the power element of the Poor People's Campaign is obviously so significant. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that, kind of a 2-piece question. One is about the clergy and the role of interfaith locally. The other piece of it, and related, I think, is about the courage for people to step into being organizers, and a little bit of background of each. The World Unity Week has had the United Religions Initiative as one of the key organizations and networks as a part of World Unity Week for the last 3 years, and for Unity Earth for years before that. And we see the significance of that locally in having these conversations with interfaith. We have a cooperation circle of URI here locally, and how significant that is. We've been told that in some parts of the country that why aren't more Black and poor people showing up in those conversations? And the answer we get is, well, because the Black ministers and other ministers at churches around the area think that if the white folks are okay here, that they should just keep their head down and they shouldn't be out grabbing attention and that sort of thing. After George Floyd's murder, there were 7 straight days of action in the streets in Johnson City. But within a year, it all had faded away and everybody had just gone back into the shadows again. And the second part of my question, so that part of the question is about the role of clergy at the local level for all that you've been talking about. The second piece of it is the courage for others to organize, because when you talk about these movements being led by those most affected, even in this one little sample of us organizing a bus to come to DC last weekend, we found it very difficult in our place of privilege, a homeowner, white, voting, poll workers, to find those that would get on the bus, even though the seats were sponsored by other people. The seats were free for those who couldn't afford it, but they could have, if they could afford the day to go with us to DC, to have their voice heard directly and the presence with them standing there in the street. And so if you could share a little bit more about the courage of those of us that are trying to organize and how to accomplish that when we haven't been organizers around these sort of things in the past. Any thoughts you have about either of those? Yeah,
so I'll start with this question about faith, because if we look back at the 1968 campaign, the last crusade that Dr. King, waged before he was shot down, there were not major national faith bodies that were involved in that work. Now, after he was killed, some folks got involved. But when we launched the Poor People's Campaign about 4 or 5 years ago, we said, we need the legitimacy and the connection to faith leaders. Over the course of these years have found the support of 20, 30 of the largest national faith bodies in the country. So that's the AME folk, that's the Baptists, that's the Union of Reformed Judaism, that's a network of engaged Buddhists, that's folks that are Hindu and Sikh, that's the Islamic Center of North America, that's or Society of North America, that's other, it's different United Methodist and Presbyterian, and it's really across, it's evangelical and Catholic and ecumenical and representing just millions upon millions of people. Now we're very clear that there's lots of people that are not people of faith who are in this work, but we also are clear that our faith traditions, admonish us to that the least of these are most of us, and that we have something to do about addressing these issues. And so it really is amazing to see all of the different faith leaders all across the country who are coming in and working alongside of others, doing this work. And it's also amazing to see the folks that are not people of faith, but who believe that the arc of the universe bends towards justice, or at least we need to make it bend that way, and are out there, organizing and mobilizing. And I think that then that connects to this question of movements being led by those that are most impacted. Frederick Douglass puts out this call that those who would be free must strike the first blow. Those in pain know when their pain is relieved, right? And what we've seen throughout history, and we're seeing today, whether it's the Starbucks workers that are organizing, or Dollar General folks, whether it's the unhoused of the Northeast or the Pacific Northwest, or whether it's families who don't have health care in states that have not expanded Medicaid. We see a powerful movement rising up that is being led by those that are most impacted. Now, right now, if you're talking about the problem of poverty, it's for decades, we've heard very little in our society around poverty, and we've definitely heard, if we hear about poor people, it's either to pity folks or to punish them, right? It's never to see and recognize the power and power potential of poor and low income people. but what changes that is movement. What changes that is people coming together. What changes that is having a stage like we did last Saturday, where poor and low income people from almost every state across the country, put out what people are going through, but also what they're doing to change those conditions. And that was also a message to others of the 140 million people who are poor and low income in the society, that there is a movement growing that is calling everybody, including and especially those that are most impacted, into leadership of this movement. And so,
Awesome.
change does not happen overnight. And it takes people organizing and mobilizing. But I can tell in World Unity Weeks, the folks that are organizing this is that we're on our way, and
Right.
then it can be done.
We're just about out of time, but Ben, we'd like you to jump in here if you would, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Liz. This is firstly, just thank God for the poor people's movement. The work that you're doing is so profound and so needed and so necessary. So it's a great, privilege for us to learn from you and to understand. And of course, we'll share the website and how people can get involved. Bob and Noel are very significant influence in this beloved community here. So we'll continue to beat the drum and support the work. I have a question for you as a theologian. I'm really struck by how you laid it out before, that really the sponsoring act here that has so many consequences, unwanted consequences and disastrous consequences, comes back to a theological perspective ultimately at its source. And this idea of the unholy alliance between nationalism and religion, of course, is not just a uniquely American experience. We see Hindu nationalism in India and Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar, Islamic nationalism across the Middle East. It's a global concern. My question, I guess, to finish up on today, Liz, is what are the success stories of helping people transition from that place of being caught up in an ethnic, ethnocentric, nationalistic, religious environment to actually move along the conveyor belt towards a more enlightened, a more unitive, and a more wholesome understanding of theological interpretations. And I'm asking this in the context of usually what we see happen is when people from that framework have it broken down, it can be very brittle, and then there's an abandonment of faith and religion altogether, rather than moving along what Ken Wilber or integral theory might talk about, an evolutionary process. But I'm sure that you at the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barbara, and yourself are thinking about how can we impact the ideas at the source and help to evolve the theology towards a more inclusive and wholesome, life-affirming theology rather than one of superiority and domination.
Well, I mean, I think that exactly what has happened over the last decades, and it's been decades in the making. But again, even that wasn't new, but is putting out a theology and a biblical and theological framework that actually is not true to our religious faith traditions. And I think what we have found is that when people hear a different gospel, a different good news, that folks are very hungry and very ready for it. And so there's a lot of success stories, right? I mean, if we think about Jesus's inaugural sermon in Luke 4, he says, this is where he makes his entrance, right? And he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. God has anointed me to preach good news, evangelism to the Potokos, those made poor by policy and structure, right? And so then anything that comes in the way of that is not actually the good news, the gospel, the evangelism of anything other than empire, right? If it's not about raising wages, if it's not about expanding healthcare, if it's not about welcoming the immigrant neighbor, then it's not it's not what's actually at the core and foundation of our theological traditions and practice. And people can say it is, and can be very loud about it, and can can misquote biblical passages, but it doesn't make them any more true and anything less of adherence to empire. And so I think that so the success that we're having is that people are hearing a different message, and seeing different, like the actual biblical and theological foundations for a movement for justice, and can see and hear and experience that there is a message of liberation, of justice, that is throughout our faith texts. And that's true. I'm speaking especially to Christianity, because in the US context, if we're going to look at who is out there spreading kind of a message of division and of lies, it's mainly white Christian nationalists. But I agree that there are folks in other parts of the world who are also trying to hold on to their power, or get some power, and then cloak themselves in an irreligious religiosity. But again, what I see is people just so hungry for a different message, and for the message that actually again starts in Genesis and goes all the way through our texts, and is there crying justice along the way.
Thank you, Dr. Liz, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. And I want to say one thing in closing. Our symbol there says World Unity Week, and that's kind of a misnomer, because we have 99 days of peace and unity. And that will, Ben, I think the date for the peace and unity in September is
September 17 to 24. September 17 to 24 for Peace Week. That's right. Now,
parallel to that, the Poor People's Campaign also has during this time. Liz, what are you calling it? It's well, you're going to end up back in DC in September. So between now and September, I don't know if your date coincides exactly with ours, but it would be lovely to have you and Reverend Barber back and have us amplify your message, because it is so powerful. It is so needed. It is so close to my heart. And I just want to thank you for being here. And thank you, Ben, for making this opportunity. Thank you, Liz, for accepting. I know you have another guest coming in. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Noel. Thank you, Bob, for your co-creation here and bringing Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. We're really honored, Liz, to have you with us. And if there's a way we can support and, working across whole systems transformation, all the issues here, and the ones you laid out at the top, injustice, for poverty, the ecological crisis, and all those the intersection of those issues is really a space that's of great interest for all of us. So we'd love to follow up. We are on a journey towards 99 Days of Peace through Unity. We're celebrating globally the 40th anniversary of the first International Day of Peace, which was first celebrated in 1982. So we're building up across the world, really. And we'd love to support and continue the partnership with you over these precious days and this critical time for the United States and for the world. And thank you for being with us, Liz Theoharis, today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Blessings all.
Okay, Mr. John